Okay, this is page 131. This is also in part 2, and it's called the Midday. It takes up where the forenoon leaves off, and we know that the forenoon leaves off in Ashley's pasture, where 21 people reached together with 30 people there and created a small little group of men who were willing to go against the British. All right, so the Reverend never let a Sunday go by without imploring his congregation to fear God. Oh, you know what? I'm sorry. Hang on. Let's go to the next slide where the questions are. Duh. All right, moving on. The questions are, what was meant when Moses said, and we're talking about, yes, Moses, but this is a memory. We have established the new matriarchy on page 132. What effect did remembering what his father said have on Adam? 2, what questions of ethics are raised when Solomon Chandler declares we fight in God's cause? Why does the Reverend not agree? 3, compare and contrast the battle styles of the British and the colonists. That's an important question because that's part of the reason that we were somewhat successful in those early skirmishes. And then 4, in war, do the rules that govern human behavior change? How does the incident with the redcoats support your answer? All right, now I'll begin reading. I'm sorry, page 131. The Reverend never let a Sunday go by without imploring his congregation to fear God. And that was one of the matters I used to brood upon, think about, as a part of passing the time in church. I don't think that anyone with a fairly honest recollection of his childhood will fail to admit that time passes more slowly at meeting, at church, than anywhere else, unless perhaps, as I've heard some say, in jail. And one of the things that always plagued me in church was that no matter how hard I worked at it, I couldn't truthfully say that I feared God. The way I saw it, he simply did not rate with father or mother or darkness or the witch's house behind the meeting house, or the schoolmaster or old cantankerous Gideon Fail, who hated children so much he always whacked away at them with his stick when they came within reach, not with any of them as an object to be feared. If we had been high church, Anglican, like some of our more distant relatives in Boston, and had prayed to an impersonal and elegant God, I might have come to the proper attitude. But the Reverend clung to Jehovah as the proper name for what he softly and lovingly would describe as the Ancient of Days. And somehow or other, the name Jehovah invoked no menace at all. If one of Mother's seafaring relatives had turned up and been introduced to me as Jehovah Hatch, I would have considered it natural and not impious. Also, I once overheard Father and the Reverend discussing this very matter, and Father leaned to the opinion that our race, meaning Presbyterians, and some Congregationalists, and some Quakers, but mostly Presbyterians, were not afraid of God, but of women. We have established the new matriarchy, he said, and that led me to Granny for an explanation of what the word meant. It means your father never grew up, she said, but then went on to explain it properly. I subsequently decided that there was a good deal of truth in what Father said. In any case, I have never seen men really relaxed unless they were in a position secure from intrusion by women. No matter how hard and bad their case might be, they took it as a holiday. And even though what had happened in our town cast a gloom over everyone at Ashley's pasture, the evil tidings of the massacre could not wholly dissipate the feeling among the people. Some had happened and more would happen. But here it was in between in the April sunshine, and as balmy and sweet a day as Massachusetts had ever known. I felt aggrieved at first that they were not weeping with me in my sorrow. But then I remembered what Solomon Chandler had said, and tried to comfort myself with the fact that life continued. I was beginning to understand, though vaguely, that it must continue, even if our common was to become the common of every town in Middlesex. The men were all in little groups of relatives and neighbors, some of them toasting bacon over the fires, some cleaning their weapons, some just sprawled out comfortably and chatting. It almost sounds like they're on a hunting trip or something, doesn't it? Many of them stopped to say a kind word to me as I passed among them, and here and there, and increasingly so, were men from home who had stood with me through that night on the common. I was amazed at how many were alive and turning up here, for somehow I had the impression that most of us had been slain in the first fire. Plainly, this was not the case. From what I heard, listening to this group and that one, there were 6 assembly points spotted between the Monotony Road and Watertown. That was to give the committee men gathered at these various points the freedom to move north or south, depending upon what road they had to cover. Meanwhile, the committee men from the west of Sudbury River and west of the Concord River would converge on the North Bridge to hold the western bank of the river there. The British would reach Concord if they had not reached it already, but they would go no further, and after what had happened at the Common, some of the men maintained that it would be just as well if the British remained there. More and more I began to understand what an amazing piece of organization my father and the other committeemen had carried out. It was true that no one was shouting orders, that men just drifted in from every direction, without appearing to be in much of a hurry about it, and that the 100-odd men sprawled about in the pasture looked as unlike an army as anything you might conceive of. But nevertheless they were carrying out their purpose with a calm that astonished me, and they were where they had to be, with time enough to spare. There are a number of men who wore the blue and white ribbon of the militia officer on their hats, and they kept coming to Solomon Chandler, who sat on a bit of the stone wall with my cousin Dover from Lincoln Town. Cousin Dover was trying to make a tally in a small black notebook he carried in his pocket, checking off names with a quill pen. His ink was balanced on a rock, and he sat on the stone wall as serious and businesslike as if he were in the store back at Lincoln and going over his accounts. Meanwhile, Israel Thatcher, the news carrier from Medford, was selling his papers and gathering news to piece together the story of the massacre and questioning everyone who had been on the Common. He attempted to borrow Cousin Dover's pen and ink and notebook, arguing that an accurate history of the day was more important than any muster book. But Cousin Dover informed him that he would do better to wait until the day was over before he wrote its history, and unless someone had enough sense to bother with a muster book, it might make poor history indeed. Further, he implied that he didn't think very much of a news carrier who would come out on a day like this one without some writing materials. Cousin Simmons had a cold meat pie in his jacket pocket, and he insisted that I share it with him. I tried to explain that Solomon Chandler had shared a whole provision bag with me, but that wouldn't satisfy him a bit. He just knew that I'd feel better if I ate something, so I took half the pie just to please him. As a matter of fact, after the first bite, I enjoyed it thoroughly. I had never considered Goody Simmons to be much of a cook, but I must say that she did an old-fashioned meat pie as well as anyone. "I guess Moses is dead," he said to me. "There's no doubt, is there?" "No, sir, they brought him into the house." "Who did?" "Mother and Granny and Cousin Rebecca." I told him about the smokehouse and how Levi had found me there, and then he took hold of my hands and told me, plain and quiet, that while nothing could ever replace Moses Cooper in my heart, I could turn to him just as I would to a father. It meant a good deal to me to hear him say that, because he was just not saying it. He meant it. It wasn't very easy to get to know Joseph Simmons. He was one of those big, heavy-muscled, slow-speaking men who seem to think through every word they utter, but once he set his mind to something, he did it, no matter what price he had to pay, and if he gave his word, he kept his word. He knew what had happened on the Common, and running away was worse for him than it was for me, since he was a grown man. "We're going to fight them today, Adam," he said to me. "I know. Things happen in fighting. Yes, sir, I guess the most terrible and unexpected things happen. I pray to God to spare us both, Adam." "Amen to that. But no one knows. As Jehovah wills it, so it will be. But if anything does happen, I want you to tell it to Ruth, and be kind and considerate of her, Adam. A girl is a frail thing, and not easy in the world until she has a home and a family of her own. I promised him, even though I couldn't think of Ruth Simmons as a frail thing. She was one of the strongest and healthiest girls in our town. We heard gunfire. It was distant and faint and in the direction of Concord, but it brought everyone in the pasture to his feet, and we stood there listening and staring. Then a rider came across the field, spurring his horse, selling over a stone wall, and pulling up hard and sharp at the pasture, with everybody crowding around him to hear the news that he brought. Church bells were ringing again. It was hard to say exactly where the bells were, but you could hear them from the south and from the west. The rider brought the news that the British army was in Concord. Most everything had been taken away from there and hidden, only some hogsheads of wheat flour left. Who would have dreamed that the redcoats would smash them up and strew the flour all over the place? But according to the writer, that was exactly what they had done. The redcoat officers were outside the inn, drinking everything and paying for nothing, and making a great picnic out of the whole thing. There were no men to speak of left in Concord, only women and children. But the gunfire? Demanded Solomon Chandler. What of the gunfire, man? The rider didn't know. He had only heard the gunfire as he had approached us, but he did know that there had been talk among the British of destroying the North Bridge, and the militia were on the west bank of the river. There might have been a fight at the river. There was more gunfire while we questioned him, scattered bursts and then single shots popping lightly, so faint it was hardly possible to define them with any certainty. Well, what are their plans? Do they leave Concord? He didn't know. He pleaded his thirst, and someone handed him a water bottle. The day was turning hot and preparing to be the hottest day of the year until then. Do you have the nerve to go back there? He was asked. He did. He nodded his head vigorously. His horse was a beautiful chestnut gelding. He was about 19 years old and proud of his riding. He said if it had to be, he'd ride through the Redcoat Army. Never you mind such tricks. Well, what do we want him to do? Go back and listen for when they march. And then cut into the road and ride down before them, yelling an alarm. You're a young man. You got a good set of lungs. Well, don't shoot at me by mistake. Go on with you. He rode away, waving back at us. Solomon Chandler stood up on the stone wall, and the men gathered around. I didn't count them then, but I'm sure there were well over 100 in the pasture. One man had 2 hunting dogs with him. Send the dogs home, neighbor, Chandler said. There's no need to flush what we hunt. It raised a laugh, and I could see how much they enjoyed the old man. He stood up on the stone wall, tall and skinny as a fence rail, his hands in his pocket, his long rifle slung over his back, his pipe in his mouth. Then he tapped out his pipe on the back of one hand and said, Well, here we are, neighbors, and whoever would have thought it would come to fighting on a fine Middlesex morning like this one? But it has. It has. The Redcoats danced, didn't they? And now they got to pay the piper. It wouldn't be at all proper to let them go home and exact no payment. I know that the reverend could say all and more that must be said, and when he does, I do hope that he will turn to Exodus 21 from the Bible. For it is written there, He that smiteth a man so that he die shall surely be put to death. And if a man lay not in wait, but God deliver him into his hand, then I will appoint thee a place whither he shall flee. But if a man come presumptuously upon his neighbor to slay him with guile, thou shalt take him from mine altar, that he may die. Amen, came up from the pasture. Amen. Now, how many of you are riflemen? Raise your weapons. About 20 men raised rifles, holding them up over their heads for Solomon Chandler to see. Good, the old man said. Go over to my left and separate yourselves, and I'll be captain with you, and Joshua Dover with the muskets and bird guns, unless anyone else wants to propose it differently. If they do, I am willing to hear. Why can't we just stay together, Solomon? You answer that, son. A musket gun carries 100 paces. A rifle carries 400 paces. That calls for 2 different kinds of tactics entirely. Now, just let me explain what I have in mind. Consider the 5 miles of road between here and Lexington. It seems plain to me that the Redcoats are going to march down the stretch of road. It would be 5 miles more by the way of Lincoln to Watertown, and no sense whatsoever, so it's safe to presume they'll take the road to the north of us. All that 5 miles to Lexington and 10 more miles to Charleston will give them no peace whatsoever. At least half the stretch of that road is binded with stone wall. We'll lie down behind that wall and make them mighty uncomfortable. I wondered, could you be shot down and run away in such fear as we had on the Common, and then fight and win? All of it on the same day? It was one thing to see the Redcoats in the distance, and something else to have them close up against you. If someone had to tell them, I was still not the one. I went with Cousin Simmons and the file of men walking toward the road, and it didn't seem possible that we are at war, not even with the shots popping like Indian corn in the distance. The Reverend was with us. He had a gun now, a bag of shot, and a bottle of powder, and under the day's growth of whiskers, his face was sad and lonely. Solomon Chandler came over to wish me Godspeed. Prime your gun careful and don't ever fire unless the man's upon you. Count his buttons. A gun like yours won't stop a man at more than 30 paces. Yes, sir, I said, I'll heed your words. Take no pleasure in it. Let it hurt, but become hard in the sorrow. Would you tell him that? The Reverend asked. And you too, Reverend. I tell you that. We'll weep for them, but they brought the killing to us, not us to them. God help us all, the Reverend said. I say amen to that. We fight in God's cause. Nobody fights in God's cause, the Reverend replied harshly. Isn't it enough to kill in freedom's name? No one kills in God's cause. He can only ask God's forgiveness. The old man heard this respectfully. As you say, Reverend, I would like to dispute it somewhat, but there ain't time. Then he turned off with his riflemen to find a hummock overlooking the road, while we filed through a scrub of woods to the stone wall that lined the road. We took our places on the blind side of the wall, a man of us every few yards, stretching down along the road to where it curved out of sight, and with the road itself not 10 paces from where we were. We'll keep down after we shoot, Cousin Simmons said, and get out. Then we can take other places down the road. It's just death to try to remain here with the roadway full of British regulars. Most everyone agreed with him, and when Cousin Joshua came down the wall to check our positions, he said the same thing. How long to wait, Joshua? The Reverend asked him. The Reverend was on one side of me, Cousin Simmons on the other. I hear the shooting plainer, don't you? We were sitting on top of the wall. It was strange to see the men sitting there, as far as the wall stretched, and I couldn't remember anything like it that I had ever seen before. Plainer, I think. It was so. The pop, pop, pop of the gunfire was becoming louder. It no longer sounded like Indian corn. My heart began to hammer wildly, and suddenly I felt that I would burst if I didn't pass water. Do it here, Cousin Simmons said. I can't do that with the Reverend watching. Don't be a fool, boy. Don't you think the Reverend does the same thing? He'll be doing it enough before the day's through. Go ahead and put modesty away, Adam. The Reverend agreed. I did it. It was woefully hot, the sweat pouring down my face, and Cousin Simmons said why didn't I take off my coat. I replied that I couldn't, because I might lose it in the excitement, and it was the very best jacket coat I had ever owned, and brand new in the bargain. And you wore it last night? Cousin Simmons cried. The Reverend burst into laughter. It was the first time any of us had laughed since the morning began. The rider from Concord was as good as his word. He came spurring and whooping down the road, his horse kicking up clouds of dust, shouting, "They're a-coming! By God, they're a-coming! They are!" We heard him before he ever showed, and we heard him yelling after he was out of sight. Solomon Chandler hadn't misjudged the strength of his lungs, not at all. I think you could have heard him a mile away, and he was bursting at every seam with importance. I have observed that being up on a horse changes the whole character of a man, and when a very small man is up on a saddle, he'd like as not prefer to eat his meals there. That's understandable, and I appreciate the sentiment. As for this rider, I never saw him before or afterwards, and never saw him dismounted, so whether he stood tall or short in his shoes I couldn't say, but I do know that he gave the day tone and distinction. The last thing in the world that resembled a war was our line of farmers and storekeepers and mechanics perched on top of the stone wall, and this dashing rider made us feel a good deal sharper and more alert to the situation. We came down off the wall as if he had toppled all of us, and we crouched behind it. I have heard people talk with contempt about the British regulars, but that only proves that a lot of people talk about things of which they are deplorably, awfully ignorant. Whatever we felt about the redcoats, we respected them in terms of their trade, which was killing. And I know that I, myself, was nauseated with apprehension and fear, and that my hands were soaking wet where they held my gun. I wanted to wipe my flint, but I didn't dare to, the state my hands were in, just as I didn't dare to do anything about the priming. The gun would fire or not, just as chance willed. I put a lot more trust in my 2 legs than in the gun, because the most important thing that I had learned about war was that you can run away and survive to talk about it. The gunfire, which was so near that it seemed just a piece up the road now, stopped for long enough to count to 20, and in that brief interval, a redcoat officer came tearing down the road, whipping his horse fit to kill. I don't know whether he was after our rider, who had gone by a minute before, or whether he was simply scouting conditions, but when he passed us by, a musket roared, and he reared his horse, swung it around, and began to whip it back in the direction from which he had come. He was a fine and showy rider, but his skill was wasted on us. From above me and somewhere behind me, a rifle cracked. The redcoat officer collapsed like a punctured bolster, and the horse reared and threw him from the saddle, except that one booted foot caught in the stirrup. Yuck. Half crazed by the weight dragging, the dust, and the heat, the horse leaped our wall, dashing out the rider's brains against it, and leaving him lying there among us while the horse crashed away through the brush. It was my initiation to war and the insane symphony war plays, for what had happened on the common was only terror in flight. But this grinning, broken head, not 10 feet away from me, was the sharp definition of what my reality had become. And now the redcoats were coming, and the gunfire was a part of the dust cloud on the road to the west of us. I must state that the faster things happened, the slower they happened. The passage and rhythm of time changed, and when I remember back to what happened then, each event is a separate and frozen incident. In my recollection, there was a long interval between the death of the officer and the appearance of the first of the retreating redcoats, and in that interval, the dust cloud over the road seems to hover indefinitely. Yet it could not have been more than a matter of seconds, and then the front of the British Army came into view. It was only hours since I had last seen them, but they had changed, and I had changed. In the very front rank, 2 men were wounded and staggered along, trailing blood behind them. No drummers here, no pipers, and the redcoats were covered with a fine film of dust. They marched with bayonets fixed, and as fixed on their faces was anger, fear, and torment. Rank after rank of them came down the road, and their faces were all the same, and they walked in a sea of dust. "Committeemen, hold your fire!" a voice called, and what made it even more terrible and unreal was that the redcoat ranks never paused for an instant, only some of them glancing toward the stone wall, from behind which the voice came. The front of their column had already passed us, when another officer came riding down the side of the road, not 5 paces from where we were. My cousin Simmons carried a musket, but he loaded it with birdshot, and as the officer came opposite him, he rose up behind the wall and fired. One moment there was a man in the saddle, the next a headless horror on a horse that bolted through the redcoat ranks, and during the next second or two, we all of us fired into the suddenly disorganized column of soldiers. One moment the road was filled with disciplined troops marching 4 by 4 with a purpose as implacable as death. The next, a cloud of gun smoke covered a screaming fury of sound, out of which the redcoat soldiers emerged with their bayonets and their cursing fury. In the course of this, they had fired on us, but I have no memory of that. I had squeezed the trigger of my own gun, and to my amazement, it had fired and kicked back into my shoulder with the force of an angry mule, and then I was adding my own voice to the crescendo of sound, hurling more vile language than I ever thought I knew, sobbing and shouting, and aware that if I had passed water before, it was not enough, for my pants were soaking wet. I would have stood there and died there if left to myself, but Cousin Simmons grabbed my arm in his vice-like grip and fairly plucked me out of there. So he is taking care of him, isn't he? And then I came to some sanity and plunged away with some extraordinary speed that I outdistanced Cousin Simmons by far. Everyone else was running. Later we realized that the redcoats had stopped their charge at the wall. Their only hope of survival was to hold to the road and keep marching. We tumbled to a stop in Deacon Gordon's cow hole, a low-lying bit of pasture with a muddy pool of water in its middle. A dozen cows mooed sadly and regarded us as if we were insane, as perhaps we were at that moment, with the crazy excitement of our first encounter, the yelling and shooting still continuing up at the road, and the thirst of some men, which was so great that they waded into the muddy water and scooped up handfuls of it. Isaac Pitt, one of the men from Lincoln, had taken a musket ball in his belly, and though he had found the strength to run with us, now he collapsed and lay on the ground dying, the reverend holding his head and wiping his hot brow. It may appear that we were cruel and callous, but no one had time to spend sympathizing with poor Isaac, except the reverend. I know that I myself felt that it was a mortal shame for a man to be torn open by a British musket ball, as Isaac had been. Yet I also felt relieved and lucky that it had been him and not myself. I was drunk with excitement and the smell of gunpowder that came floating down from the road, and the fact that I was not afraid now, but only waiting to know what to do next. Sorry about that, guys. Meanwhile, I reloaded my gun, as the other men were doing. We were less than a quarter of a mile from the road, and we could trace its shape from the ribbon of powder smoke and dust that hung over it. Wherever you looked, you saw committeemen running across the meadows, some away from the road, some toward it, some parallel to it, and about a mile to the west, a cluster of at least 50 militia were making their way in our direction. Cousin Joshua and some others felt that we should march toward Lexington and take up new positions ahead of the slow-moving British column. but another group maintained that we should stick to this spot in this section of the road. I didn't offer any advice, but I certainly did not want to go back to where the officer lay with his brains dashed out. Someone said that while we were standing here and arguing about it, the British would be gone, but Cousin Simmons said he had watched them marching west early in the morning and moving at a much brisker pace. It had still taken half an hour for their column to pass, what with the narrowness of the road and their baggage and ammunition carts. While this was being discussed, we saw the militia to the west of us fanning out and breaking into little clusters of 2 and 3 men as they approached the road. It was the opinion of some of us that this must be part of the committeemen who had been in the Battle of North Bridge. We entitled them to a sort of veteran status, and we felt that if they employed this tactic, it was likely enough the best one. Mattathias Dover said, "It makes sense. If we cluster together, the redcoats can make an advantage out of it, but there's not a blessed thing they can do with 2 or 3 of us except chase us, and we can outrun them." That settled it, and we broke into parties of 2 and 3. Cousin Joshua Dover decided to remain with the Reverend and poor Isaac Pitt until life passed away, and he was hurt so badly he did not seem long for this world. I went off with Cousin Simmons, who maintained that if he didn't see to me, he didn't know who would. "Good heavens, Adam," he said, "I thought one thing you'd have no trouble learning is when to get out of a place." "I learned that now," I said. We ran east for about half a mile before we turned back to the road, panting from the effort and soaked with sweat. There was a clump of trees that appeared to provide cover right up to the road, and the shouting and gunfire never slackened. Under the trees there was a dead redcoat, a young boy with a pasty white skin and a face full of pimples, who had taken a rifle ball directly between the eyes. 3 men were around him. They had stripped him of his musket and equipment, and now they were pulling his boots and jacket off. Cousin Simmons grabbed one of them by the shoulder and flung him away. "God's name, what are you to do? What are you to rob the dead with the fight going on?" Cousin Simmons roared. This is the question number 4. They tried to outface him, but Joseph Simmons was as wide as 2 average men, and it would have taken braver men than those were to outface him. They blustered and then took off, and I asked Cousin Simmons who he thought they were. "Never saw them before. I'll tell you they're no committee men. I'll tell you that, Adam. Most likely they're Boston men, the way they behave." He didn't think highly of Boston men for reasons I went into earlier. I couldn't help looking again and again at the face of the dead redcoat. What struck me hardest was how small he was. Perhaps it was his position in death, but he appeared no taller than my brother Levi, and his purple lips were drawn back from a mouth half toothless. His blue eyes were wide open, and his face was so thin and pitched and starved that I became sick all over again and wept as I vomited. Cousin Simmons pulled me away, and then as we approached the road, he got down on his knees and crawled. I did as he did, and soon we were in a space between 2 rocks, with the road a bit beneath us and some 50 paces away. There was no powder smoke here now, but westward, where the road ran through a dip, there was a great deal of firing and a whole cloud of smoke. Here the redcoats were plainly visible as they trudged by, their faces grim and murderous, their scarlet coats no longer bright. 2 dead redcoats lay on the edge of the road, on the side away from us. 4 others who were wounded sat alongside the dead. As they marched, a cart drawn by a brace of mules appeared in the column. The soldiers continued to march, crowding around the cart, while it was loaded with the dead and the wounded. There must have been half a dozen dead bodies already in the cart, and 2 wounded men shared the space with them. Now 2 more dead and 4 more wounded filled the cart to overflowing. We could hear the wounded moaning and cursing in their pain as the cart went by, and Cousin Simmons whispered that war was a dirty and terrible business. "We don't know any of them," I whispered back. "They're strangers here in our land. We don't know who that boy back there is. We'll never know his name. No one will." "We got to make war on them, Adam." "Then let's shoot. I can't stay here like this." His hand gripped my shoulder. "Easy," he whispered. "Now 1, 2, and then we both fired. A redcoat flung out his hands and fell. 2 others yelled in pain from my birdshot, and then the whole column was screaming curses in our direction and loosing a volley of musket fire. We lay pressed to the ground as the balls whined overhead and buried themselves in the trees, and then we leaped up and got out of there, racing through the woods, leaping a stone wall, and then panting and listening to the cursing rage and the constant sound of gunfire. "Water, please," I begged Cousin Simmons. He handed me his bottle and said, "Finish it, Adam. Then we can get water at the Atkins place over yonder." I drained the whole bottle, stared for a moment at Cousin Simmons, and then said, "No more." "Isn't it enough?" That's not for me to say, Adam. Listen to the gunfire. That's our flesh and blood fighting there. Can you walk away from them? Will it bring my father back? No, Adam. Nothing will bring him back. But we're not fighting an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That's how old Solomon Chandler sees it. But the scripture is not meant to be taken literally, as some would have it. This is a war, Adam. Why? Why? A man's land is his own, Adam. Remember I told you about land. A man's place is his own. All we wished when we stood out on the common was to tell them that this was our place. We had no riches or gold or silver. Your father would have said to them, go home and leave us be. This is our place, our common, our meeting house, and our houses. We are a committee to defend what is ours. There will be trouble if you march onto our land and work your will on us. That's all he wanted to say to them. But they chose to have it differently, and now it's too late. The war is all over us. He rose and pointed southward, where a broad wheat field sloped up to the horizon. Men were coming across it. The word went out, and the sound of shots carried farther than you could hear them. And all morning the men had been coming, and still they were coming as the news was passed on. We went on to the Atkins place. They had a barn that was less than a quarter of a mile from the road, and on the peaked roof of the barn 4 riflemen stood, firing as carefully as if they were on a turkey range. Solomon Chandler was one of them, but I no longer felt any warmth toward the old man. I would kill and he would kill, but he took pleasure in the killing. Cold as ice, he stood up there on the roof and picked his targets from the smoky road. He waved to me and shouted, I got me a redcoat officer, laddie boy. There he was up on the road on his prancing horse, 300 paces, and I picked him off neat as a feather. The hand of Jehovah reached down and smote him. Another man joined us below and called up to them, Can you see the whole redcoat army? Well, there ain't smoke, you can see it. Where there ain't smoke, you can see it. But it ain't the whole redcoat army. Oh, no. Not by a bushel or two, sir, no. As a matter of fact, the road was defined by the powder smoke that lay over it. The noonday sun was overhead, and it was a windless, unseasonably hot day. Some of the smoke drifted and dissipated, but most of it hung over the road like a thick curtain, a fact that the redcoats should have thanked God for, since without the smoke to cover them, it was questionable whether a man of them would have gotten through. We learned later that the British commander was ready to surrender his army at this point. Can you imagine? But there was no one to surrender to, and often enough, lying sleepless at night, I imagined how that march might have been for the redcoats, trudging down that burning road, the dust and the powder smoke choking them, a pale sun burning through, and the Middlesex men hidden behind stones and walls and trees. The firing never stopped. It blazed up at one point and then another. About 30 men had gathered at the Atkins place, and we went up the road to fire a volley into it. Then we went back to the well where the Atkins women were drawing water. All our fear of the redcoats had vanished, and somehow we knew as certainly as if they had signed a paper to such effect, that they would not break their march and leave the road. Yet perhaps not all our fear, for there was one thing we did not do, and that was to blockade the road and stop them. It was one thing to fight them as we were fighting them, something else to stand up to their muskets without cover. Mrs. Atkins and her daughter Esther and her 12-year-old son Ishmael were all drawing water and working at the well fit to break their backs. They were good-hearted people, the women a little subdued by the number of menfolk in their family, and a good deal bewildered by the fact that a part of the war was being fought a quarter of a mile away. Aside from being thoughtfully placed along the British line of march, their well was a deep one with a considerable reputation for cold and pure water. When we got there, Cousin Simmons couldn't bear to watch those women breaking their backs over the well handle. He said he didn't think that war was any reason for men to turn into hogs and women into slaves, and he took over the handle himself and then shamed some others into turns. Those women had raised 50 buckets out of the well already, and anyone who ever turned a well handle knows what that means. It's quite painful, actually. Myself, I must have drunk half a bucket of ice-cold water, sweet as honey, and some more to pour over my aching head. The Atkins women had brought every scrap of bread and provision in their house, and no one went away from there hungry. I was wolfing down some sausage and bread when Esther Atkins came over to me and asked whether I wasn't the Cooper boy from Lexington. I said I was. She was a handsome girl of 17 or so, with black eyes and black hair, and it was said that she had more suitors than a dog has fleas. Handsome means beautiful. It's not calling her like a man. But the last time I saw you, you were just a shaver, a little boy. I'm 15, ma'am. I heard tell about your father, Moses Cooper. He was your father? Yes, he was. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, indeed I am. One of her own brothers would be dead before the day was finished, but neither of us knew that then, and she brought me a piece of berry pie out of the kindness of wanting to do for me. Many people were kind and gentle on that day. It wasn't unrelieved horror, and fewer were cruel than you might have thought. I saw at least 3 men carrying wounded neighbors on their backs, and there was another incident as we moved eastward that was worth remembering. You see, about 30 men had gathered at the Atkins place. Some of them were Lincoln Town men who had come up with cousin Joshua Dover, and others were from the neighborhood and from across the Sudbury River. 2 of these were in the fight at the North Bridge, where Yankees of Massachusetts fired upon the British for the first time, although they held, as we did, that not a man among them fired his weapon until the redcoats had loosed a volley and slain 2 good Concord men and wounded others. The leader of the Sudbury men was one Allen Beckett, a small, nervous, energetic man who complained bitterly that the battle was being fought without rhyme or reason, that nothing had really been planned, and that for all our cutting and sniping at the British, we were letting a whole army of them escape, when here was a golden opportunity either for capturing them or wiping them out to the last man. For my own part, I was ready to live and let live. I was beginning to react to the sleepless night, and every muscle and bone in my body felt my fatigue. It appeared to me, from all that I had ever read or heard about war, that a battle was fought quickly and then put away to rest and wait for inclusion in the history books, and I felt that I had been through 3 battles already, and it was enough. But Beckett held otherwise, and he was persuasive enough to bring the men around to his way of thinking. He said that instead of running back and forth to the road to take pot shots at the redcoats and wearing ourselves out in the process, we should head southeast and pick up the Monotony Road south of Lexington, about 5 miles from where we were now. Even without hurrying, we could reach the spot before the British did, and as we moved, we could gather to all of us the committeemen we encountered. With even 100 men, we could try to trap the British somewhere between Lexington and Monotony, and if we could hold them up for an hour or 2, we might find that several thousand committeemen had arrived to join us. It all seemed very iffish and offhand to me, but Cousin Simmons agreed that it was at least a plan of a sort, and that was better than just milling around with no plan at all, with everyone a commander and everyone changing his mind. By now, Solomon Chandler and the other riflemen had come down from the barn roof, and they gave their support to Beckett's plan. The last stragglers of the Redcoat army had passed by the point of the road opposite us, and while we could overtake them easily enough, Chandler was of the opinion that it made far more sense to try to cut them off south of Lexington. More men were joining us, and when we began to march, we numbered better than half 100. While we were almost a mile south of Concord Road, when we crossed the Lincoln Road, 15 or 20 minutes later, and just as we were crossing it, as luck would have it, a redcoat cavalry patrol came down from the north, perhaps scanning to see whether the road to Lincoln might offer an alternative route of escape. There were 4 men in the patrol, and as they came into sight, at least 20 of us fired on them. 3 of them whipped their horses around and got away, but the 4th fell out of his saddle and lay in the road, his horse standing beside him. It was poor shooting, but I had discovered that it was always poor shooting when men let off their pieces in a hurry, never stopping to consider or take reasonable aim. It was a condition I was grateful for, since it kept a good many folks alive, who would be otherwise dead. We rushed over to the fallen man and crowded around him, not yet being enough of soldiers to suspect the possibility of a larger force returning, and we saw that he was conscious, with a bullet hole in his shoulder. He was a pink-cheeked boy of about 20, and after he looked at us, he closed his eyes and prepared to be shot to death by the barbarians we had been described to him as being. But his courage wasn't sufficient to prevent tears of pain and fear from rolling down his dirty cheeks, and the sight of him lying there and crying and looking so much like a little boy had its effect on all of us. I knew that I had a hard time to keep from crying myself. Dr. Cody of Watertown was with us, and although our family had always regarded him as a fraud and a quack, he did a quick and handy job of stopping the bleeding and tying up the wound. Then we picked up the boy and carried him all the way to the Dunn house, where we left him. In other words, they took him as a prisoner of war. Some of the men wanted Beckett to ride his horse. I respected Beckett for saying that he would feel foolish up there, and anyway, he deferred to Solomon Chandler's age. Chandler was pleased, as a boy, at riding the British filly, his rifle dangling forward like an old-time lance. Cousin Simmons remarked that there was nothing to bring out a man's innermost character like being up on a horse while everyone else walked along on the 2 feet God gave him. Okay. We'll talk about this for a minute, and then I want you to answer the 4 questions in your reading journal. Remember to go to the learning targets for today, copy the 4 questions into your reading journal document. There should only be 1 reading journal document for me to check. And then answer these questions. And ladies and gentlemen, I want you to write these as paragraphs. Topic, sentence, direct evidence, and then your commentary. All right, go ahead.